Hello, listener. You're here now, and that means it's time to rest. Tonight's story is meant to be heard in the dark, with rain or fire sounds as your only light. If you're still awake, leave a comment. What time is it where you are, and are you listening alone? Subscribe and click the notification bell to return for more stories in the dark. Story 1. The Locked Door in My Grandfather's Cabin. I should have listened when the old man told me never to go into the woods alone after the rain. My name is Marcus. It all started when my grandfather passed away and left me his remote, rustic cabin in the dense, old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was a quiet, solitary man, and the cabin reflected a sturdy, two-room structure of dark timber, perched on the edge of a ravine so deep the bottom was perpetually shrouded in mist. The inheritance came with a single, hand-written condition scrawled at the bottom of the will. Marcus, the key for the root cellar is in the blue tin. The door stays locked. Do not open it, ever. The place was beautiful in a lonely, imposing way. I arrived on a Thursday, the air thick with the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves. I planned to spend a long weekend cleaning it out, maybe deciding if I wanted to keep it or sell it. The normalcy of the task was comforting. But from the moment I stepped inside, little things felt off. The air inside was several degrees colder than the chilly forest air, a deep stone cold that settled in my bones. All the mirrors were covered with old, yellowed sheets, and on the heavy oak door that led to the root cellar door reinforced with iron bands 3 different locks gleamed, new and stark against the weathered wood. I found the key in the blue tin on the mantel, just as Hedi said. It was a single, old-fashioned skeleton key, cold to the touch. The first night was uneventful, just the symphony of the forest, owls, the wind in the high branches, the creak of ancient timber settling. But on the second day, after a sudden, heavy afternoon downpour, things changed. The rain tapped a frantic rhythm on the roof, and as it slowed to a drip, I heard a new sound beneath it. A slow, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt floor beneath the house, from the root cellar. I froze, my book half closed in my hand. It came again. Scrape, pause, thump. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a bear that had found a way in. That's the logical explanation, right? But my grandfather's warning echoed in my head, and the sheer overkill of those 3 locks on the cellar door suggested something a raccoon couldn't explain. Okay, let me ask you guys something, because I was seriously questioning my sanity at this point. What's the weirdest, most inexplicable sound you've ever heard in your house when you thought you were alone? That moment where your blood just goes cold. Put it in the comments because I need to know I am not the only one. I spent the next hour pacing, trying to rationalize it. By dusk, the sound had stopped. The forest was preternaturally quiet, not even a cricket chirping. The false sense of safety was a trap, and I fell right into it. I convinced myself it imagined it, amplified by the isolation and my grandfather's superstitious note. I needed to prove to myself there was nothing to fear. I took the skeleton key from the tin. Its metal was still oddly cold. I walked to the reinforced door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The first lock, a modern deadbolt, clicked open smoothly. The second, a heavy padlock, took a bit of jiggling. The third was an old, rusted barrel bolt that screamed in protest as I slid it back. I took a deep breath, turned the iron handle, and pulled the door open. A wave of air rolled out. It didn't smell of damp earth or potatoes. It smelled of ozone, like after a lightning strike, and underneath that, a sweet, cloying rot like forgotten flowers. A steep set of rough-hewn stone steps descended into absolute blackness. I flicked on my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a small, circular, earth-walled room. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No shelves, no jars, no old tools. Just hard-packed dirt floor and walls. And in the very center of the floor, a perfect dark circle of wetness, as if the rain had seeped through in that one spot, even though the cabin had a solid foundation. Relief, hot and dizzying, flooded me. See, nothing. My grandfather was just an eccentric old man. I closed the door, relocked all 3 locks, and went to bed feeling foolish and free. That's when the whispers started. Not from the cellar door, but from the walls themselves. A low, sibilant murmur just below the threshold of comprehension, as if several people were having a conversation in the next room. I lay rigid in the bed, the old blankets pulled to my chin, praying it was the wind, but the night was still. The whispers grew more distinct, not in language, but in intent. They felt hungry, curious. Then the scratching began, not from below, but from inside the walls at the head of my bed. Delicate, persistent, like fingernails on plaster. I didn't sleep. At first light, the sounds vanished. The cabin was just a cabin again, but the atmosphere was poison. The cold spot in the main room had grown, and the covered mirrors now seemed less like eccentricity and more like a necessity. I decided to leave a day early. As I packed my bag, I noticed something on the floor by the front door. A trail of faint, muddy footprints. They weren't mine. They were small, bare feet, and they led from the reinforced root cellar door to the threshold of the cabin's front door, and then they stopped, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. Or walked out. I ran. I threw my bag in the car, fumbled with the keys, and sped down the mountain track, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. I made it all the way to my apartment in the city, 2 hours away. I poured a drink, turned on all the lights, and tried to laugh it off. A prank. A hallucination. I was safe. Concrete and streetlights and people surrounded me. The fear began to recede, replaced by a numb exhaustion. I took a long shower, the hot water scalding my skin, washing away the forest chill. I stepped out, wiping the steam from the bathroom mirror, and I saw it. Reflected behind me in the corner of my steamy bathroom was a dark, damp footprint on the tile floor. The whisper started again, not in the walls, but right beside my ear, a wet, guttural rasp that formed a single, clear word. Found. The climax wasn't a chase. It was a slow, horrifying realization. The thing, the presence from the cellar, hadn't been trapped in the cabin. It had been trapped by the cabin, by some boundary my grandfather had maintained with those locks, those covered mirrors, that specific rule. By opening the door, even though the cellar was empty, I had broken the seal. I had invited it to follow, and it had. It was in my home. It wasn't a ghost that rattled chains. It was a predator that learned. It would hide. It would whisper. It would leave just enough evidency, a misplaced item, a cold draft where there was none. A flicker in the corner of my idol let me know it was there, feeding on my fear, waiting for me to be truly, completely alone. I moved. I sold all my furniture. I got a new apartment across town, a studio with no history on a high floor. I told no one. For a month there was nothing, peace. I started to breathe again. Last night I came home from a late shift. I was pouring a glass of water in my sleek, modern kitchen when I heard it. A faint, wet, dragging scrape from inside my brand new, empty closet. I stood there, the glass trembling in my hand, and I understood the final, terrible truth my grandfather's note had implied. It wasn't about locking a door in a cabin. It was about locking a door in your mind, refusing to acknowledge what might be on the other side. Because once you know it's there, once you've seen the empty space it inhabits, it knows you right back. And it never really leaves. It just waits for the rain to stop. I put the glass down very slowly and walked to my closet door. I haven't opened it. I can hear it breathing on the other side. And I know, sooner or later, it'll have to look. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you felt that chill down your spine, you're not alone. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. It helps more people find these tales. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next journey into the unknown. And tell me in the comments, do you have any doors in your life you've been told never to open? Story 2. What the photo album revealed about me. I have to warn you about the things we inherit, the boxes we unpack without thinking. The pieces of the past we assume are just stories. My name is Ava, and until 3 weeks ago, my biggest concern was whether the vintage wallpaper in my grandmother's house was a charming feature or a design nightmare. Id inherited the place after her quiet passing a 2-story clapboard house at the end of a winding, tree-choked lane, filled with the pleasant, dusty smell of old books and lavender sachets. It felt like a sanctuary, a blank slate. The only oddities were small, easy to dismiss. The way the grandfather clock in the hall never ticked, its hands forever frozen at 3:07 a.m. The fact that none of the mirrors in the house seemed to reflect color quite right, giving everything a faint sepia wash. and the single, heavy black velvet curtain always drawn over the small window on the landing, which I never bothered to open. The process of sorting through her belongings was cathartic. I found china, moth-eaten linens, and stacks of letters tied with ribbon. Then in the attic, under a drift of old National Geographic magazines, I found the album. It was large, bound in cracked leather the color of dried blood, with no title on its spine. The first pages were normal faded photos of my grandmother as a young woman, smiling stiffly next to a man I assumed was my grandfather, whom I'd never met. But as I turned the pages, the photos changed. They became older, daguerreotypes and tintypes, portraits of severe-looking people in stark black clothing. Their eyes seemed to follow my fingers as I traced the glass covering their faces. And then I saw a face that was my own. Not similar, not a familial resemblance, but my exact face, staring out from a photograph dated 1898. I was wearing a high-collared black dress, my expression empty, my eyes holding a flat, dark knowledge I've never felt. My blood turned to ice water. I slammed the album shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a coincidence so profound it felt like a physical blow. I shoved the album back into the box, deciding to deal with it after a glass of wine and a good night's sleep. So tell me, have you ever seen a photograph that felt wrong? Not just creepy, but personally, intimately wrong, like it knew something you didn't. That night, the house began to speak. It started with the photographs already on the walls, benign ones of landscapes and flowers. As I passed them in the dim evening light, the images seemed to subtly shift in my peripheral vision. The bouquet in the gilt frame by the stairs would seem to wilt as I walked by, petals turning black and drifting down the painted canvas. I'd spin to look directly at it, and it would be perfectly normal. I chalked it up to stress and an overactive imagination. Then came the sounds. Not bumps in the night, but the soft, unmistakable shuffling of pages turning, always coming from whatever room I had just left. I'd walk into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and hear the quiet rustle rip of an album page from the living room. I'd return to find nothing disturbed. The false safety came a week later. I'd mustered the courage to take the album to a local historical society. The archivist, a gentle older man with kind eyes, flipped through it carefully. "Remarkable preservation," he murmured. When he got to the photo of me, he paused. "Ah, a striking resemblance. That's Eleanor Vane, quite a tragic story. Died young in a house fire right here in town. They say she was involved in some unusual practices, trying to extend her line, some folk tales say. Not that I believe in that sort of thing." He laughed softly. The explanation was logical, historical. A doppelganger, a sad, superstitious tale. The relief that washed over me was so profound I felt dizzy. I left the album with him for further study, driving home feeling lighter than I had in days. The house felt like a home again. That evening, I even opened the black velvet curtain on the landing for the first time. The window beneath was oddly opaque, not glass but what looked like smoked, dark resin, letting in no light at all. Puzzled, I closed the curtain again, but the sense of peace remained. I slept deeply that night for the first time since I'd arrived. I was woken not by a sound, but by a smell, the acrid, throat-clenching scent of smoke. I bolted upright, my mind screaming fire. But the house was dark, silent, and cool. No orange glow, no crackle, just the pervasive, ghostly smell of burning timber and something else, something oily and organic like burning hair. It clung to the back of my tongue. I got up, checking every room, every outlet. Nothing. The smell was strongest on the landing right by that curtained window. As I stood there, shivering in my nightshirt, I heard a new sound from downstairs. A soft, wet sticking sound, like tape being pulled from a wall, but slower, more deliberate. Pull, pause, pull, pause. Fear held me frozen for a full minute. Then a stubborn, desperate anger took over. This was my house. I marched downstairs, following the sound into the living room. The room was moonlit, everything in its place. The sound stopped. And then I saw the wall above the fireplace. The large landscape painting that had hung there for decades was gone. In its place, fixed directly to the wallpaper, was the photograph. The 1898 photograph of Eleanor of me. But it was no longer a small print in an album. It was life-size, stretched across the wall, its surface glistening wetly as if freshly developed. and it was changing. The sepia tones were bleeding, the face contorting. The mouth in the photo opened, not in a smile, but in a silent, widening scream, the eyes hollowing into pools of absolute black. The wallpaper around its edges began to curl and blacken, as if from a heat only the photograph could feel. A cold deeper than any winter wind poured from the image. The scent of smoke became a choking fog. From the corners of the room, shadows began to detach themselves, not cast by anything but solidifying into human shapes tall, thin, wearing the same stark black as the people in the album. They didn't move toward me. They simply turned their head-shaped darkness toward the photograph on the wall in a gesture of reverence or hunger. A voice, dry as falling ash and old paper, whispered directly into my ear, though nothing stood beside me. It was my voice, but worn thin by centuries. The album was not her history, Ava. It is the contract. The window is not a window. It is the seal. You are not the inheritor. You are the final signature. I stumbled back, my legs buckling. I didn't run for the door. I ran upstairs toward the only thing that felt like a clue, a weapon, anything's black curtain. I tore it down. The dark resin pane beneath was no longer opaque. It was clear as glass, but it did not look out onto my overgrown garden. It looked into a room, a perfect, silent replica of my own bedroom behind me. And in that room, a woman in a nightshirt stood with her back to me, staring at the wall. I saw myself from behind. I watched as the me in the window turned slowly, her face a mask of dawning, infinite horror, staring not at me but at something standing right where I was standing. I felt a hand, bone cold and impossibly dry, settle on my own shoulder from behind. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the face of the woman in the window, me face-smithing 2 words with desperate urgency. Don't turn. I awoke at dawn in my bed. The house was silent. The smell of smoke was gone. The painting was back above the fireplace. There was no photograph on the wall, only a faint, rectangular watermark on the wallpaper, barely visible. It could have been there for years. I told myself it was the most vivid, terrifying nightmare of my life. A psychological break from stress and isolation. I've tried to believe that, but things are not right. My reflection in the mirrors is a half-second too slow. Sometimes in the quiet, I hear the faint, satisfied sound of a page being turned in an unseen book. And I have never, ever opened that black curtain on the landing again, because I know now what I am really preserving in this house. I am not the owner of this legacy. I am the kept. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you felt that chill down your spine, you're not alone. Please give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people find these tales. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the unknown. And in the comments below, I have to ask, what's the strangest thing you've ever inherited? Story 3. What I saw in the cabin walls. I need to tell you about the walls because I think they're listening. My name is Tyler, and 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandfather's cabin. He was a quiet, stern man who built the place with his own hands in the 1950s, tucked away in a dense pine forest so remote that GPS gives up halfway there. The inheritance came as a shock. We weren't close. The lawyer's letter called it a bequest of solitude and history. I was between jobs, between leases, and frankly, between breakdowns. A free, isolated cabin sounded like the perfect place to reset to right, to escape the noise of a life that felt like it was crumbling at the edges. I packed my car with boxes of books, my laptop, and a sense of determined optimism that, looking back, was painfully naive. The drive was an exercise in shedding civilization. Paved roads gave way to gravel, gravel to packed dirt ruts that wound like scars through the trees. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and pine resin. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly as I remembered from a single childhood visit. A 2-story structure of dark, untreated logs, with a steeply pitched roof that seemed to frown under the weight of decades of moss. The windows were dark eyes. The front porch sagged in the middle like a tired sigh. I used the heavy iron key, its teeth worn smooth, and the door opened with a groan that sounded less like wood and more like a vocal cord. The inside was a time capsule. Floral wallpaper browned at the edges. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, cold and filled with ancient ash. The furniture was heavy dark oak, draped in yellowing sheets. It was dusty, yes, and a little damp, but it felt sturdy, safe. I spent the first day airing it out, unpacking, trying to impose my own order on my grandfather's silent domain. The only thing that felt off initially were the walls themselves. Not the wallpaper, but the underlying logs. In certain lights, the grain of the wood didn't look right. It was too intricate, too swirling, like the patterns weren't natural growth rings, but something else, something carved, or maybe something that had grown that way. I'd run my fingers over them and they'd feel unusually smooth, almost polished in patches, yet ice cold to the touch even though the autumn chill outside hadn't yet seeped in. I chalked it up to my grandfather's craftsmanship, an odd artistic quirk. That first night, I heard the scratching. A soft, persistent sound like a fingernail being dragged slowly along a plank of wood. It came from the wall behind the old sofa. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening. A mouse, I told myself, or a branch outside. The forest is full of noises. I went to bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin, the unfamiliar silence of the deep woods pressing in around me. The scratching didn't come again. The next few days settled into a fragile routine. I'd write in the mornings by the fireplace, make simple meals in the tiny, outdated kitchen, and take short walks that never strayed too far from the clearing. The silence, which I'd craved, began to feel thick, absorbent. It drank sound. My footsteps on the floorboards, the click of my keyboard, even my own voice when I'd speak aloud to break the stealthy all felt muted, swallowed by the cabin. And I started noticing the patterns in the walls more. They were everywhere. In the bedroom, the grain on the wall beside the bed looked unsettlingly like a face in profile, if you stared too long. In the hallway upstairs, the knots in the wood formed a perfect, repeating spiral that made me dizzy to look at. I found myself avoiding certain walls, taking longer routes through the rooms. Hey, while I'm remembering this, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a place that just felt wrong? Not because of anything obvious, but because the geometry of it seemed to fight with your own mind. Comment below, I am genuinely curious. For me, it was those walls. The false safety came on the fifth day. I'd decided to explore the small, padlocked root cellar I'd found out back. Using a rusted pry bar, I snapped the old lock. Inside, amidst jars of unidentifiable preserves from another century, I found my grandfather's journals. Dozens of them leather-bound, filled with his tight, precise script. I brought them inside, a surge of academic excitement cutting through the unease. Here was the history, the connection I'd been missing. I spent the afternoon and evening devouring them. They were mostly mundane, weather reports, supply lists, notes on repairs to the cabin. But as the years progressed, the entries changed. He wrote about the grain deepening, about the patterns becoming more insistent. He described the same scratching I'd heard, calling it the settling of the foundation. The last few entries were the most disturbing. The walls remember what the forest forgets, he wrote. I built it from the heartwood. I should not have used the heartwood. The final entry, dated the week before he was found dead in town of a sudden stroke, the lawyer had said, was a single desperate line. Do not listen to the walls when they whisper your name. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. It was just the ramblings of an old man, I reasoned. Isolation does things to the mind. The cabin was quiet that night, no scratching. I felt a wave of relief. See, I'd confronted the source of my fear, the strange writings, and now the atmosphere felt lighter. The patterns in the wood were just patterns. I slept deeply for the first time. I was woken not by a sound, but by a smell. The thick, sweet, cloying scent of pine sap, so strong it coated the back of my throat. It was coming from the bedroom wall. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam swept over the log wall, and I stifled a scream. The grain was moving. Not much. A slow, viscous shift, like molasses flowing under a dark surface. The whorls and knots pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The face-like pattern by my bed had its mouth open in a silent oval. As I watched, frozen in terror, a thin bead of amber sap welled up from the center of that mouth and began to trail slowly down the wall. The scratching started again, but now it was inside the room, a syncopated rhythm coming from all four walls at once. Tap, tap, scritch. Tap, tap, scritch. I stumbled out of bed, backing towards the door. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. As I passed the hallway, I saw the spiral pattern on the wall. There was now physically recessed into the wood, a perfect carved channel that seemed to descend into infinite darkness. A low, resonant hum vibrated up through the floorboards, a sound felt in the teeth more than heard. This was the escalation, the end of false safety. The cabin was no longer a structure. It was a wake. The climax was a silent, horrifying chase. I ran for the front door, my socks slipping on the old floorboards. The door wouldn't open. The iron deadbolt, which I never used, was slid firmly home. I hadn't touched it. I scrabbled at it, my fingers slipping. Behind me, the main room's walls began to weep. Sap oozed from seams between the logs, dripping onto the sheets-covered furniture with soft, sticky plops. The patterns were now in violent, swirling motion, coalescing into shapes, distorted limbs, grasping hands, screaming faces that pushed against the inner surface of the wood as if trying to get out. The humming grew louder, deepening into a wordless chant that seemed to originate from the very foundation. I remembered my grandfather's words. I built it from the heartwood. This wasn't just any timber. He debuilt his sanctuary from the central, oldest part of the trees, and whatever slept in this forest, whatever memory or consciousness the trees held, was concentrated here in these walls. It was a prison he deconstructed, and now I was inside it with the inmates. I turned, giving up on the door, and made for the small kitchen window. As I passed the fireplace, a log in the hearth, a log I had brought in from the woodpile outside, suddenly split with a sound like a gunshot. From the split, a gout of that same thick, sweet sap erupted, followed by a swarm of black, winged insects that hummed with the same frequency as the walls. They didn't attack me. They simply flew to the walls and began to crawl into the shifting grain, becoming part of the pattern. With a cry of pure terror, I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and hurled it through the kitchen window. Glass shattered. Cold night air rushed in, a shocking relief from the sappy, suffocating atmosphere. I clambered through, cutting my hands and arms on the jagged edges, and fell onto the damp grass outside. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, my keys miraculously still in my pocket, and I drove. I drove until the sun came up, until I found a gas station with flickering fluorescent lights and a bored cashier who didn't look twice at my wild eyes and bloodied clothes. I am in a motel now, writing this. The police took a report about a break-in and vandalism at a remote property. They didn't believe me about the walls. Why would they? I have the journals. I have the sap still stuck under my fingernails, smelling of forgotten forests. But here's the thing, the ending I can't escape. This morning, as I was trying to wash the scent away in the motel shower, I looked down at the simple tiled wall. And in the grout lines, in the random speckles of the ceramic, I saw the beginning of a pattern. A tiny, familiar spiral. It's probably nothing. My mind is traumatized, seeing threats everywhere. I keep telling myself that, but I can feel it watching me from the walls, waiting for me to be still long enough to listen. Thanks for listening to my story. If you felt that chill, that sense of something lurking just out of sight, then you understand. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the shadows. Your support helps keep the lights on while we explore the darkest corners. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in that cabin. And remember, next time you're in an old building, take a closer look at the grain in the wood. You might just see something looking back. Story 4. The highway that drives itself at night. I didn't believe in cursed roads until I tried to outrun one. My name is Ava, and this is the story of the night I learned that some highways don't just connect places, they consume them. It all started with a simple, stupid mistake. I was driving back from a friend's wedding. A 6-hour slog I'd foolishly decided to tackle after the reception to avoid paying for another hotel. GPS on my phone had died. My charger was a frayed mess in the glove box. And I'd taken a shortcut suggested by a weathered old road sign that simply read to State Route 9. The normal highway, clogged with late summer construction, was a parking lot. Route 9, according to the map I'd glanced at hours before, ran parallel. It seemed like a gift. At first it was fine, better than fine. The asphalt was smooth and dark, freshly paved, with a bright yellow center line that gleamed under my headlights. The forest on either side was a solid wall of black pine and fir crowding right up to the gravel shoulder. But there were no billboards, no reflective mile markers, no signs of other cars. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the hum of my tires. That was the first unsettling detail, the complete lack of sound-absorbing undergrowth. No crickets, no owls, just a vacuum. The second was the smell. About 20 minutes in, a cloying, sweet scent drifted through my vents, like honeysuckle and wet earth, but with a faint, metallic undertone that made the back of my teeth ache. I rolled up the windows. The third detail was the road itself. It began to feel less like a road and more like a conveyor belt. The gentle curves were perfectly uniform, the inclines and declines so smooth they were almost imperceptible. My steering wheel had a faint, persistent pull to the left, as if the car was being guided. It'd correct it, and a minute later my hands would be subtly turning again. It was hypnotic. My eyes grew heavy. I cranked the AC and slapped my own cheek. So let me ask you guys something, because I think about this a lot now. What's your biggest fear when you're driving alone at night? Is it another car, or is it the road itself? For me, it used to be other people. Now I know it's the emptiness. I shook myself, focusing on the broken white line zipping past. That's when I saw the first figure. A man in a dark coat standing perfectly still on the shoulder facing the woods. He didn't turn as I passed. My heart jumped, but I told myself he was just a hunter or a hiker, though his posture was unnervingly rigid. 10 miles later, I saw another, and another. Always standing, always facing away from the road, spaced at eerily regular intervals. They were like signposts made of flesh. A deep, cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I needed to get off this road. I started watching for an exit, a turnoff, anything. But the exits, when they came, were wrong. The green signs were faded, their text illegible. The off-ramps themselves were overgrown with thick, thorny vines that glittered in my headlights like barbed wire. One ramp had a chain across it with a sign that read in stark, hand-painted letters, "Not a way out." Panic tightened my throat. I fumbled for my dead phone, willing it to life. Nothing. The gas gauge, which had been over half, was now dipping toward a quarter. That was impossible. It'd only been driving for maybe an hour. The numbers on my odometer were blurring, the digits seeming to stutter and skip. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen another car's taillights. I couldn't. Then the road began to change. The smooth asphalt gave way to older, patched concrete. The trees thinned, replaced by the silhouettes of dilapidated buildings, a gas station with shattered pumps, a diner with boarded windows. It was a ghost town, strung along the highway like rotten teeth. And in the windows I saw faint, shifting lights, candles, and behind those candles dark shapes standing and watching the road, watching me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car surged forward. The town blurred past, but the road ahead remained unchanged. A tunnel of darkness punched through the endless forest. My headlights caught a new sign. It was blue, official looking. Last Chance Services 2 MILES. Hope, desperate and foolish, flared in my chest. Services meant people, a phone, a way to reset this nightmare. The Services was a single, low-slung building with a flickering neon open sign and a window caked with grime. It looked like it had been closed since the 1970s. I didn't care. I swerved into the empty lot, the gravel crunching loud in the absolute silence. The engine ticked as it cooled. I sat there, hands glued to the wheel, staring at the door. No one came out. No face appeared at the window. I had to try. I grabbed the useless phone, took a deep breath that smelled of that sickly sweet air, and got out. The silence here was even heavier, a physical pressure on my ears. My footsteps echoed like gunshots. The door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside was a time capsule. A dusty counter, empty shelves, a smell of mildew and old coffee. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, jaundiced light. And behind the counter, a man. He was old, his skin like parchment, and he was staring at a small, black and white TV screen that showed only static. He didn't look up. "Hello." My voice was a dry croak. "I need help. I think I'm lost. My phone is dead. Is there a landline?" He slowly turned his head. His eyes were milky, unfocused. "Ain't lost if you're on the road," he said, his voice like rustling leaves. "The road knows where you're going. I need to get to Interstate 90, I pleaded. "Can you tell me how to get back?" He gestured a bony finger toward the door. "Just keep driving. It'll take you where you need to be." "I don't want to go where it wants me to go," I shouted, the fear finally breaking through. For the first time, he looked directly at me and a faint, pitying smile touched his lips. "Child, you got on. You don't get off till it's done with you. Only thing ahead is the turnaround. Maybe y'all see it. Maybe you won't." Before I could ask what that meant, he turned back to his static. The conversation was over. I stumbled back outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The idea of getting back in my car made me want to vomit, but the alternative of staying in this place was worse. I got in, locked the doors, and sobbed for a full minute, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Then, with a trembling hand, I turned the key. The engine purred to life. As I pulled back onto the pavement, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old man was now standing in the doorway, watching me leave. And he wasn't alone. Several of those dark, rigid figures from the shoulder were now standing at the edge of the lot, all facing my departing car. I drove. The false safety of the service station was gone, replaced by a deeper, more resigned terror. The gas gauge was now firmly on empty, but the car kept going. The engine didn't sputter. The road began to slope downwards, a long, gentle descent into a valley shrouded in a ground fog that glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light. The sweet metallic smell was overpowering. And then I saw it, the turnaround. It was a vast, perfectly circular clearing off to the right of the highway, paved in the same dark asphalt. In the center stood a colossal, dead oak tree, its twisted branches reaching up like skeletal hands. And parked in a neat, concentric circle around the tree were cars, dozens of them, from rusted-out vintage models to vehicles that looked almost new, all empty, all facing the tree. This was a parking lot for the lost. My steering wheel jerked violently to the right. The car was turning off the main road, heading straight for the clearing. I screamed, fighting the wheel with all my strength, but it was like trying to wrestle a living thing. The car rolled smoothly into the circle, found an empty spot between a faded red pickup and a minivan with baby seats, and came to a silent stop. The engine died. I was here. This was my place. Terror held me frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then movement. From the woods at the edge of the clearing, figures emerged. Not the still sentinels from the shoulder, but things that moved with a slow, shuffling gait. They were silhouettes at first, but as they passed through the fog's glow, I saw them. Their faces were blank, smooth, as if their features had been worn away by wind and time. They didn't walk towards the cars. They walked towards the great dead tree, and they began to merge with it. They pressed themselves against the thick black bark and sank into it, becoming knots and whorls in the wood, their outlines slowly fading until they were gone. This was the destination. The road wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was a digestive tract, and this was its stomach. It consumed travelers, dissolving them into the landscape. A soft tapping at my passenger window. I shrieked. One of the smooth-faced figures was standing there, its head tilted. It raised a hand and tapped the glass again, politely, insistently. It was waiting for me to come out. My body moved on pure instinct. I turned the key. The engine impossibly sparked and roared to life. With a cry that was half terror, half fury, I slammed the car into reverse, stomped on the gas, and shot backwards out of the space. I didn't try to turn around. I just reversed, tires screeching, back onto the main highway. I jammed it into drive and sped forward, not looking back. The road began to climb out of the valley. The fog receded. The smell faded. And then, like a fever breaking, I saw a familiar green sign. Interstate 95 miles. I sobbed with relief. I followed the signs, merged onto the bustling, brightly lit interstate, surrounded by the beautiful, normal traffic of semis and families in minivans. I drove until I found a crowded truck stop, where I called a tow truck and sat under the fluorescent lights, shaking until they arrived. I told the tow truck driver it'd gotten lost and run out of gas. He found it odd, he said, because my tank was still a quarter full. I didn't explain. I had my car towed to the nearest town, checked into the first motel I saw, and slept for 14 hours. I thought it'd escape. I really did. I got a new phone, a new car charger, and for weeks I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, a waking nightmare. But then the dream started. Every night I am back in the driver's seat. The smell of honeysuckle and metal fills my car, and in the dream I always look in the rearview mirror. The road behind me is empty, but my back seat isn't. One of the smooth-faced figures is always sitting there, just waiting, its featureless head turned toward me. I wake up gasping. And last Tuesday, I found the first one. A single, long thorn from those glittering vines caught in the tread of my new car's tire. This morning, there was another on my driveway. They're souvenirs, reminders. Or maybe they're trail markers. Because I have this feeling, this cold certainty growing in my gut every time I get behind the wheel now. I didn't escape Route 9. I just left temporarily. It's a loop, you see. And once you're on it, you're always on it. It's just a matter of time before it pulls me back for the final stretch. It's waiting for me to get lost again. And the scary thing is, in a world of dead phones and wrong turns, getting lost is the easiest thing in the world. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you felt that chill, that sense of dread, you know how real these things can feel. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please show your support by giving this video a like. It helps more than you know. And subscribe to the channel for more true horror stories, whispered from the darkness. Let me know in the comments, have you ever driven down a road that felt wrong? I read everyone. Stay safe out there. And maybe check your tires. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror stories.